Everyone, welcome to our Ladies Fund virtual session. This is a wonderful series where we connect from all over, and we're delighted to welcome you. First and foremost, we want to just say we're glad you're safe and well and wish you to have complete safety at this moment. And to, I think someone's accidentally sharing a screen. Terry, are you able to stop that? Thanks. Okay, so welcome. And right now we're just all in lockdown, but glad for safety and wellness. Our series that's virtual began with a gratitude and blessings 2 weeks ago with Omar and Saida Habib were the stars. And then last week we had Cliff Shore do a very special talk from New York City, from Columbia Business School, on how small businesses can survive during this really unprecedented situation. I'm Tars Wadao, for those who are meeting me for the first time, founder of Ladies Fund. And today we welcome you to a session by Dr. Dean Allen, who is a speaker, lecturer, and pandemic historian. You can count on Ladies Fund to source a pandemic historian all the way from South Africa to be here with you today. We're also doing cutting edge things, like you see my virtual background. So we're basically, the Barak Center is Ladies Fund's incubation center for women, and it's called Barak, which is the Islamic word for unicorn, or more accurately the Pegasus, which the prophet flew to the seven heavens on. And we actually have gone the Barak Center online. And so we've given everyone in advance a copy of a virtual background, and Rafia is on standby to show you how to use it. So it actually looks like we're in the Barak Center, all of us together, which is really cool. So now I have the pleasure of introducing Dean to you. Not only is he, as mentioned, a speaker, a lecturer, and a pandemic historian, but he's this amazing gentleman who's made it his passion to help people during this lockdown. And we have along with him his colleague Terry from South Africa, who's also here today and helping change the slides for him. So you're going to see a perfect professional way they turn together. And we have on our team Ahmad, Rafi, and Bilal, who are making sure we also get a recording of this. Many people of you are sending messages for Cliff's recording. We're working on how to edit it because it was the whole hour and a half. So here now, Rafi is taking up the helm to make this one beautiful for us, and it'll be available for you all. And now I won't take your time further, but pass the floor to Dean, who I will unmute, and Terry can put his PowerPoint. And as they're sorting all that out, I'd just like to thank our visitors from around the world. We have people from London, England, like Chris Andrews, Alexa from Brussels. We have Ruth from Lagos. We have Nerys from Madrid. We have, in addition to, of course, from Pakistan, Khadija from Lahore. We have some names we can't see. We have from Brussels also Samina, and then from Toronto, Isa, Samir, Kamran, Hassan, Patrick, and Shireen. And we have Enma and Tarek from Tunis, Jenjet from New York City, and Munaza from Melbourne, and Yomi and James from Boston. So now we will welcome you all to join us here, and we will unmute our star, Dean, who's already been unmuted. So Dean, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. Good afternoon, everybody from South Africa. It's lovely to join you. It's fantastic to think we're speaking to an international audience here. So, I mean, what an opportunity. As Tara said, I've got quite an unusual background. You're probably listening to my accent. You can hear that I'm not probably South African. I was born in England, and I arrived in South Africa in the mid-90s when I fell in love with the country. And since then, I've made it my career to study the history of South Africa. But now, of course, we're in an incredible time. A lot of us are in lockdown here in South Africa, you may know. Our government imposed quite a strict lockdown almost as soon as the coronavirus epidemic became known to us. So we've now, for the past month, been homebound, so we can't leave our homes unless it's for the vital services, to go and get food, of course, and to visit medical facilities. So we certainly appreciate here in South Africa how important this is. And what we've done what I've decided to do is use that time wisely. And I think some of us are struggling, of course. Routines have changed, which mine has done as well. But I decided instead of sort of sitting back and worrying about this situation, let's be proactive and let's actually provide something for other people. So I believe that as a historian, that history should teach us about today, not only what happened in the past, but lessons for today, and more importantly, lessons for the future. So that's exactly what we've done. We've designed a series of lectures, including the one I'm going to talk today about, to give people knowledge, to give people hope, and also to give people optimism that we can learn history, we can see how we're going forward. So it's wonderful that you've all joined me from around the world today. It is now 2 p.m. here in South Africa, to give you an idea of the time scale. It's a beautiful day here. The sun is shining, so things aren't too bad. But what we're going to do today is go through a wonderful series of information that I hope will give you hope and courage. And at the end, Tara has kindly allowed me time to answer some questions from you. So please take this opportunity. And if you've enjoyed today's presentation, there'll be another opportunity to listen to it again on Monday, the 27th of April, when we'll be doing this presentation again, but alongside a colleague of mine called Andre de Toy. Now, Andre is a specialist economist and business analyst, and perhaps you'll be more informed to talk about the business questions that you've got, but I'll certainly do my best. So we'll share information about that at the end of the talk. The other lady I'd like to acknowledge, and Tara's also mentioned her already, and she's an important part of this team, is Terry Winship. And Terry is there sitting in South Africa, in Cape Town, about 4 hours from me, where I am now, and she will be controlling my slides. Because as we found ourselves in this lockdown, I'm here without the necessary technical equipment. We've made this work. We've made a plan. So Terry will control my slides remotely, but I can see exactly what you'll be seeing. So if we can start now, and then at the end we will have lots of time for questions, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. So we could have the first slide, please, Terry. Now, we've called today's presentation, when Tara asked me to do this, she was looking for me to give an informed presentation on what has happened in the past. So as I said, I've called this Learning Lessons from History, ladies and gentlemen, and that's exactly what I hope you take from today. Rudyard Kipling, I'm sure you've heard of, once said that we'd all remember our history if it was told in the form of stories. And that's my style, of course. I'm a historian and I'm an academic, but I also think that I'm quite a good storyteller. And that's why I'm quite in demand as a public speaker, because I bring stories from history that I think are important. So today we're going to look at the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. But before we start, I'm just going to go through in detail of what we're actually going to cover in the next 45 minutes or so. Next slide, please, Terry. The one before, please, my introduction slide. Here we go. Now, learning lessons from history. So the first thing we're going to do is look at global pandemics through history. And I think that's important. Many of us, of course, this is the first virus that has really affected us in our family, our friends, or us personally. But I'm going to show you that this is not the first time that mankind has been affected by a global crisis. And I think that's important. As humans, we have got through far worse times than we're struggling with today. So we're going to look at the various pandemics through history. I'm going to focus on what happened in 1918. That's the Spanish flu pandemic, of course, and that's an important indicator of what we are doing today. In fact, governments around the world have been looking at what was happening 100 years ago or so and seeing how they coped then and the lessons they learned from that time. I'm going to compare with what we are doing today, and I think that's important, and of course, what we should learn from history. And I'm going to finish up with some good news. This is not all bad news of what is happening. I think there are many lessons we can learn, and perhaps this is a time for us to reflect. This is a time for our planet to recover and for us to set a reset button for mankind. And I think we should think of it that way. So we're going to start now by looking at the global pandemics through history. Now, when I was considering the different pandemics that have occurred throughout history, of course, it was a tough job for me to do, because there are many cases in the history of mankind where we have faced global pandemics in the term of in the case of viruses. Now, the first one I want to look at there, and we'll go through each in time, is what was known as the Great Plague of London. It was actually called the Black Death. Now, we're going to go right back now to 1334, so the 14th century. Now, the reason I picked up on that was because, would you believe, the Great Plague began in China. Now, there's a comparison that we can see today, but like today, the Great Plague was also spread through travel, through people traveling across continents. Now then, because it began in China, it was all to do with the trade routes, the Silk routes, of course. Now the explorers and the businessmen would travel to the Far East, and inadvertently coming back, they would bring this virus with them. Now, the Great Plague went on to cause 25 million deaths in Europe alone and 125 million deaths globally. Now, that is quite staggering when you think about it. But the most significant thing about this case was that it lasted for 30 years. Yes, 30 years. Now, as I'm sure you'll hope, and I'm certainly gonna inform you, we are not going to be struggling with the coronavirus for 30 years. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, a bit later, we were faced with the smallpox in 1519. Again, that was brought through travel. Then it was actually spread by explorers to Southern America in the area we now call Mexico. Now, that virus, smallpox, which was brought by those explorers to the native population, it killed 25% of the native population that lived in the area or the region we know of Mexico at the time. Now, fast forward another 100 years to 1633, and smallpox was also brought by European settlers to North America. Then it killed 20 million natives. So 20 million North American Indians were killed as a result of smallpox being brought by European settlers to their continent. So again, you can see the comparison with today. It's through people traveling large distances between countries and districts that have spread these pandemics. Now, we're going to talk about the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic today, and we're going to go into more detail, but just keep this in mind. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1920 killed 50 million people in those 2 years. Now, that's a conservative estimate. In fact, some scientists claim that the Spanish flu pandemic actually killed up to 100 million people in that period. It is still, to date, the world's worst natural disaster. In fact, it infected over a quarter of the world's population. Now, that is why we're talking about the Spanish flu pandemic today, and it's going to teach us so much about how we're going to cope with the current crisis. Now, if we fast forward to 1984, I didn't know whether to include this, but you've all heard, I'm sure, of HIV/AIDS. Well, that is a pandemic that is still affecting us today. It was first discovered, or the cause of AIDS was discovered in 1984, but initially, of course, the cause was unknown, exactly like today with the coronavirus. To date, AIDS has gone on to kill 25 million people, and it's something we are still learning about. But thankfully, we now have a vaccine. There is no cure for AIDS, but we have a vaccine. And of course, we know how AIDS is spread and how it's conducted. So that's exactly the knowledge we're going to build up through experiencing the current coronavirus. In fact, again, we're learning from history. Now, in 2003, you all heard of SARS, I'm sure. That's the severe acute respiratory syndrome. Now, it gained a lot of coverage in the media. Again, it began in China. SARS was a form of coronavirus. It's related to the current virus we are all suffering or experiencing now. 8,000 cases of SARS was actually recorded and 774 deaths. Now, that's the official estimate. Now, like today, we're relying on the information that our governments and the media share with us, but it's officially recognized that 774 people lost their lives as a result of SARS. Now, in 2009, a far more virulent strain or virus appeared, and it was called swine flu. Now, that first occurred in the United States, interestingly enough. Now, the official figures that say that swine flu, I mean, we're only talking a decade ago, caused 18,000 deaths. Well, unofficially, the count could be as high as 575,000. So we have experienced pandemics within our lifetime, ladies and gentlemen, and we have got through these pandemics. And that's exactly the message I want to give today. We are sitting here with COVID-19 and the coronavirus, and we are learning lessons from the past, which will help us go forward. The next slide, please, Terry. Now, what was happening in 1918? We are talking about the Spanish flu today. We have to put this into a wider context. The context was, in 1918, the world had been gripped by the greatest war this planet has ever seen. World War I, which broke out, as you know, in 1914, was affecting the whole world. It was the Great War. It was the first highly mechanized war. People were losing their lives in greater numbers than ever before. In the First World War, 9 million troops lost their lives. 21 million soldiers were injured as a result. And we know that it not only created death, it created malnutrition, it created a world full of refugees as well. And that's the scene in which this 1918 pandemic broke out. Remember, in India, for example, they had 1.5 million troops fighting in the First World War, and that's a significant case here. So we look at pre-partition India, this world war was affecting that area as much as anywhere else. But you're probably wondering, where and how did this flu or Spanish flu break out? And I'll show you exactly where this occurred. On the 4th of March, in a military camp in Kansas in America called Camp Funston, the first recorded case of Spanish flu broke out. And we can see that in the next slide here. This is the military hospital at Camp Funston. Now, soldiers at that camp experienced what they called flu-like symptoms. So the first case was recorded on the 4th of March, as we can see here. Those flu-like symptoms included coughing, fever, respiratory problems, aches and pains, the kind of things we associate with modern flu, the kind of thing I'm sure we've all suffered from at time to time. But this became a far serious problem. By the time the authorities realized that this was no flu, no normal flu, the first group of troops had left for Europe to fight in the Great War. And inadvertently, they had taken with them one of the most vicious viruses, the most serious viral epidemics the world would ever see. And that's exactly how the Spanish flu spread at this time. So it was due, as a result, to the war and to the fact that people and soldiers were traveling, as I said, refugees as well, were traveling as a result of this great conflict. If we can have the next slide, please. Now, as we can see here, like today, civil society was gripped by this. It didn't just remain within the military, of course. This is a scene, ladies and gentlemen, from Seattle, shortly after the outbreak of the Spanish flu in America. You can see these policemen have got their homemade masks, and it's quite a graphic image, isn't it? It's something we recognize today. You see, people didn't understand what was happening here with this flu, but they realized that this was now no ordinary flu epidemic. In fact, it became a pandemic very quickly. You see, within 24 hours of showing the first symptoms, people could die from this particular virus, which is quite incredible. As you can see from the policeman on the right, he is using that mask as a piece of personal protective equipment. Now, there is quite a lot of debate even today about the use of masks, but we are relying on the lessons from the past to hopefully spread the spread of this disease throughout our populations. Now, I know one of the listeners today, one of the viewers today, has asked me that specific question, how this virus is actually spread. But we'll go into that in more detail. We know that it's spread through contact with surfaces that have been infected by this virus, but it also can be spread through the air. Now, that's what the mask can actually do. So if we sneeze directly onto somebody, there is a good chance that that virus can survive being transmitted through the air and then entering our own system. So the use of masks and gloves is something we have learned from the past, and it's what we are actually being told to do today. Now, if we look at the next slide, our medical services are actually taking great strain at the moment, and that's what happened in 1918. As I said, from the Spanish flu pandemic, people were actually contracting this, and from the signs of the first symptoms, they were then almost to the case of losing their lives within 24 hours. Can you imagine that? Now, thankfully, the coronavirus is not so virulent in terms of the way it affects us. We know we can actually carry this around without showing any symptoms. In fact, from contracting the virus to showing the first symptoms can be up to 2 weeks as well. But this was different with the Spanish flu. Not everybody, of course, died from it, but we know there was a higher mortality rate. But these scenes from the war in 1918 are quite significant because the war is one of the mechanisms which spread the virus rapidly at this time. And I want to show you a video now from those times which will give you an idea of what was happening.
Sorry, Dean.
Hello, I believe you're back to me.
Yeah, I'm just getting the computer sound done. Sorry.
Thank you. This video is quite interesting, actually. We discovered it during our research, so I hope you enjoy it.
Okay, I'm playing.
Thank you.
And the war is over. Into Market Street for the men and women of the city to celebrate. Up and down the street they parade, delirious with joy. For some of them have come to know the meaning of war. Grotesque and ugly in their influenza masks, the people of San Francisco celebrate. You've seen the signs they carry. Kaiser Wilhelm is Sweet William now. Who is afraid of the Huns? Some of them signs of hate, most of them just outpourings of a great joy. For this day, November 11th, 1918, marks the end of an era of hate and bloodshed and violence. It's the beginning of peace and goodwill on earth. And those who have died have not died in vain. They've died to make the world safe for democracy. They've swept to victory in the war to end war. And so San Francisco celebrates in 1918 because the war is over and there'll never be another.
Thank you. Sadly, are we back to me, Terry?
We're on the slide
Sadly,
showing influenza pandemic mortality.
Thank you, thank you. Sadly, we know that that wasn't the war to end all wars. There was going to be another world war that began in 1939. But what you probably noticed from those incredible scenes, those grainy video footage, was that people were actually wearing masks. Now, that was the homecoming parade in San Francisco in 1918. Interestingly enough, a lot of the cities around the world that were involved in the war, they had to make their own decision on whether they were going to have this parade. For example, in Seattle, which we know was an example of an area that actually got a good control and kept the rate of infection low, they decided to cancel any homecoming parade after the First World War. Interestingly, in Philadelphia, they did not. The Philadelphia mayor decided that he was going to hold a parade for those returning troops. Within a week of those troops returning, 14,000 people got infected and lost their lives, which is quite incredible. That means that those homecoming parades and those large social gatherings were direct resulted in this virus being spread. And it's exactly what we're being told today, isn't it? Let's avoid large social gatherings. Now, if we look at the next slide here, the other thing we're quite obsessed with at the moment is this idea of the spike of this pandemic. Well, it is exactly what they were doing in 1918 and 1919, as you can see here. There are a large increase. If we can go back to the previous slide, please, Terry. There is a large increase in the graph. You can see that there is a spike in the graph and also a decline. Terry, thank you. But also you can see that there is a second wave. Now that's something we've got to keep in mind here. There could be a second wave coming with the coronavirus. So when our governments and our authorities assure us that we have reached the peak, you've got to be aware that if we go back to normal life, if we go back to normal large gatherings like we saw in those parades, there is a chance that there could be a second wave here. Now, I think that is a high probability that we must be aware. Now, the media, of course, has a massive role to play in all this. Today, we're fortunate. We can put on the TV, we can go onto our laptops and look at the internet. Well, they didn't have the internet or the TV back in 1918. So how did they share the information? Well, it was also done through media. As you can see here on the right is a headline in a newspaper from Minnesota here. Public places are ordered closed, and alongside other headlines from the First World War. The authorities soon realized that they needed to inform people and inform people quickly that the social practices that needed to be adopted. Now, we're seeing today with our own leaders, you probably followed the news from America, someone like Donald Trump, he was very keen to say that this was not America's problem. In fact, he was even trying to call this the Chinese virus, if you remember, in those early few weeks. Now, I believe that our governments have a responsibility not to make this political. We are here waiting for their information. Now, here in South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, the president, has done a very good job, we all think, of actually coming out early and giving clear, concise information to us. And that's exactly the role of governments now. We need strong leadership, and also the role of the media. We've all heard of fake news, haven't we? So it's important that we listen to presentations like this. I'm not saying what I'm saying is 100%, accurate, but we need to be informed. So we need to gather information as individuals and be informed. But of course, the way we actually treat this virus all comes down to our own personal decision. If we can look at the next slide, we can see a wonderful image from a family in America in 1918. Clearly, they are taking the threat of this pandemic seriously. And it's quite amusing, of course. I mean, humor helps us through this. And I wanted to share this wonderful image with you. You can see this American family clearly care about their pet. Right in the center, if you can see, is the pet cat. We'll call her Tigger. Tigger there has a mask of her own. So it's quite fascinating how people actually are reacting to this. I hope this family got through that pandemic, because clearly they're taking the necessary precautions. But what I will say, a lot of people have asked me while I've been doing these talks, well, does this virus actually affect our domestic pets? Well, thankfully, there is no evidence to suggest that the virus has been spread to and via pets, animals such as cats and dogs, certainly in the domestic setting. But interestingly enough, there was a report from America only last week that said that a tiger in one of their zoos that actually contracted COVID-19, which suggests we don't understand how this interacts with animals as well. So that's something to keep in mind. If I could have the next slide, please. Now you'll see here, people cope with this in different ways. This wonderful image that I found during my research shows a lady who has some form of air filter here. She's clearly at home, she's breathing in this oxygen, this filtered air, and she's reading her journal. Now I hope that her investment in that machinery was worthwhile. But as we can see, it's this idea that we're keeping our airways clear, we're actually breathing in good air, and it means we're not having contact with other people in this virus. And that's something we'll discuss as we go on. Now, you're probably wondering why it's called the Spanish flu. Now, that is one of the most interesting stories that I've discovered. This sign here in a yard in America shows the Spanish influenza. Now, they're using that term in America. Why would they do that? It says the Spanish flu here has endangered the prosecution of the war in Europe. There are 1,500 cases in this Navy yard. 30 deaths have already resulted. Spitting spreads Spanish flu. Do not spit. Well, that's a notice to actually think about our own social practices, of course. Spitting, we don't want to encourage that anyway, but now they understood now that this kind of transfer will actually spread the flu. But why was it called the Spanish flu? Now, there's an incredible story behind this. Well, remember that America and large parts of the world, Western world, were at war. They did not want to have the label of this pandemic attached to them, exactly like Donald Trump is doing today. He wants to call this the Chinese pandemic. Well, it was the Spanish, you see, that got the name. Now, how did they get it? Well, remember that the Spanish were neutral in the First World War. So as British and American and Indian troops were traveling the world and contracting this disease, those authorities looked to Spain because Spain was neutral. They were reporting freely their first cases of these viruses. So the first people to contract the Spanish flu, or the flu in Spain, it was reported like this. If I can take the next slide, please, Terry. It's an interesting notice that appeared from the Spanish news service in May 1918. It said, a strange form of disease of epidemic character has appeared in Madrid. The epidemic is of a mild nature, no deaths reported. Well, I can tell you within 2 weeks of that appearing in the Spanish press, 100,000 Spaniards had been infected by this pandemic. But interestingly enough, the Spanish did not recognize that they'd been labeled with this pandemic. Did you know that the Spanish actually called the 1918 pandemic the French flu? Yes, that's right. They blamed the French for spreading this virus to Spain, which is interesting to me because it shows that we don't want to take responsibility for these pandemics. In fact, we all should take responsibility for these pandemics. And in fact, Alfonso XIII, the Spanish king, was one of the first people to actually contract the Spanish flu. And that's why the Spanish were so keen to spread information about this. But there's your answer. This is why it is called the Spanish flu. So what about situation elsewhere? Now I want to look at the next slide, if I may. We're going to look at South Africa. Now, I'm speaking here from a beautiful part of the world. I don't know if you've ever visited South Africa, ladies and gentlemen, but I encourage you to do so. But South Africa was affected in greater numbers than a lot of other places in the world. And when I looked at this, there were clear evidence to suggest why. Now, the South Africans were involved, of course, as being a British colony in the First World War. And it was the war that spread the virus to Southern Africa. In fact, the first case of the Spanish flu being detected in South Africa occurred on the 13th of September 1918. And it won't surprise you to hear that it was with the arrival of those troop carriers, those troop ships that were bringing the troops back from the war. Now, the first case appeared in a port city called Durban. I'm sure you've heard of Durban. And within 1 week, the first case had actually been recorded in the other major port city, which was here in Cape Town. The problem is with the Spanish flu in South Africa is the authorities here did not really understand about isolation and quarantine. So they only told the returning troops to stay on those ships for 3 days. In other words, they only had 3 days of quarantine, and that was not enough. So if you didn't show any symptoms, you were allowed off of that ship after 3 days, and you could then travel back to your families and friends who were delighted, of course, to see you, but you didn't know that you were inadvertently spreading this virus throughout the country. And that's what happened. So via the ports and the extensive rail network, as well as a migrant labor system here in South Africa, this virus spread like wildfire. In fact, throughout the mining community, where the Africans were working, they were traveling between mines and they were also spreading this virus. And that is why the government of South Africa today are so keen to prevent the spread within our townships and our closely knit communities, which is certainly something you will understand in Pakistan. Within 6 weeks, there were 300 deaths in South Africa of the Spanish flu. 6% of the population. In fact, it was known as Black October. It's quite incredible. Why was this? It was the lack of information. Poor individual health, poor sanitation, and poor healthcare led to this pandemic here in South Africa. Perhaps we can look at comparisons with what happened in pre-partition India in a minute. In fact, we went on to talk about 500,000 deaths in South Africa in total. There were 500,000 deaths. It became the 5th worst hit country in the world. But what had the title of #1 in terms of the worst hit country in the world? Where you are sitting today, many of you. Pre-partition India was the worst affected. And we could go to the next slide, please. Here we can see pre-partition India. It became the world's worst affected country. Up to 18 million deaths. That's right, 6% of the population. The first reported case was in Bombay in May 19, and again it was spread by the war. 1.5 million troops who had served in World War I were returning to that part of the world, and inadvertently they were bringing this virus back to India. In fact, the pandemic actually reached the Punjab province a little bit later in August 1918, but I've seen from my research for this talk in particular that within 3 months of the arrival of that virus, 800,000 people had lost their lives as a result in the Punjab province alone. Now, what caused this? What gave pre-partition India the unfortunate title of the worst affected country from the Spanish flu? Well, I believe it was the inadequate colonial rule at the time. It was exposed. Of course, India was a colony of Britain, but the poor services that were provided at that time, the lack of infrastructure, such as the poor health system, the lack of medical personnel, for example, many were still serving in the war, and overcrowded living conditions. And it is that is the key point here, the overcrowded living conditions that many people still experience today in Pakistan and India that will be the biggest threat to eradicating the coronavirus, as it is here in South Africa. In fact, if you look at what happened then in 1918, many people shunned Western medicine. So they were looking to their old systems of traditional healing. Now, that wasn't very effective, of course. There was also poor information. Many people were not respecting social movement. In fact, the disorganized postal service, would you believe, also hampered the efforts to actually inform people how they would get over this pandemic. In fact, the media played a role as well. The fact that there was an inadequate postal service and the fact that the newspapers could not reach people meant that the information that was provided in those crucial early months in India was not reaching the people. And in fact, I'm going to show you a quote now which shows how absolutely uninformed a lot of the population must have been. Somebody's got their mic on. If you wouldn't mind muting it for me, please, Tara. The Times of India quoted, would you believe that the main remedy for the Spanish flu is to go to bed and not worry? It is quite incredible. But can you imagine that people are relying on the news? They're relying on the government to tell them what to do. And this is why, in places like India, this pandemic took hold. And this is why it was so disastrous in those first few months. If we can go to the next slide, I'll give you the figures. Well, as we can see from this image, clearly, it was not enough to go home and not worry. This is a graphic image from that time. These are corpses being cremated in the streets of India in 1918. Now, if we look at the figures here, within the first month, millions lost their lives. Now, the troops returning from the First World War, the close living conditions, of course, spread this virus amongst the population. These images that we are seeing are quite graphic. There are very few images from India, actually, quite interestingly enough, but that one is a graphic one. Within 1 month, over 10 million people in pre-partition India lost their lives. We know that up to 18 million, in fact, probably lost their lives in this region. Now, it's recognized 10 million, but again, the official figures and what scientists are actually arguing now, it could be closer to 18 million. Now, the social economic impacts, a lot of you are going to ask me questions about that today, which I welcome. But the social economic impacts were, like today, just as severe. Now, because people were worried, of course, about this pandemic, this invisible killer, they started to flee the cities and head to the country districts. That meant that the industry started to close down. Business and factories lost their workforce. There was a workforce shortage in effect. It meant that food production actually was affected. The infrastructure of the country started to collapse. In fact, we could see that agriculture was affected as well. We could not harvest the crops to feed the population. And that's not just the case in India in 1918. We're actually seeing that in a place like Great Britain right now. You may have seen the reports that farmers are desperately sending out pleas in Great Britain for people to help to pick their crops. Otherwise, they're just going to waste away where they grow. Now, this is quite incredible, really, when you think about it. Now, of course, the social economic impact would lead to the price of food as well. Perhaps we're going to see, in fact, we will do, I'm sure, see a spike or a rise in our basic food costs as we come out of this. And that was the same in 1918. In fact, a famine was declared in some provinces. So as you can see, from a socio-economic point of view in India, the 1918 pandemic was quite disastrous. And what happened also? There was a drought. I know in large parts of the world, including here in South Africa, we do not have regular rainfall. So a drought will make things worse. And would you believe in parts of India, a 1918 drought actually compounded what was happening to do with this pandemic. So it made things worse. If we look at controls though, certainly soon people started to realize that things like personal disinfection would help. So people's own personal cleanliness, disinfectants, and at medical stations started to be introduced. In India, we also saw the closing of schools eventually. The large social gatherings such as fairs, festivals, sporting events, etc. We realized that after people got together in large numbers, there was an impact. As we saw in that parade in Philadelphia, back in America, if people got together, this virus spread. You see, that's what this virus, like today, needed. It needed live people to transfer from one host to another. Recovery was slow. We know in pre-partition India that this had a great effect. Now, some of you are going to probably wondering, well, which are the countries that came out of the 1918 pandemic quicker? Well, it would be no surprise that the powerhouses, the empire of the time, probably you can say Britain and America, those Western superpowers recovered quicker than the likes of pre-partition India and those third world areas that did not have the resources. In fact, many countries were so affected by the First World War that this pandemic just absolutely devastated any social economic recovery for years to come. But there was good news. There was good news. There was one thing that happened that I can see through my research in that part of the country. If we can look at this quote. Like everywhere, a crisis brings people together. I believe it brings out the best in us as mankind. And that's what happened in parts of India. As you can see from this government report, remember it was a colony still, so perhaps this was political spin, but I do believe that this happened. Never before, perhaps, in the history of India has the educated and more fortunately placed members of the community come forward in large numbers to help their poorer brethren in time of distress. And that's exactly what a pandemic like this will do, as it does today. Everybody is affected by this, no matter about your ethnic background, your wealth, your status. Everybody can be affected by this virus. And that's exactly what happened in pre-partition India. Perhaps people got together. All people from social economic classes got together and realized they were in this together. So perhaps this led to an independence movement that we saw in years to come. In fact, one of the most famous people that actually contracted the Spanish flu in 1918 was none other than Gandhi. So Gandhi, as that leader of the independent movement in that part of the world, learned the lessons from 1918, could see what this was doing to society, and as we can see, move forward to 1937, it was 47, excuse me, it was going to change that part of the world forever. If we can move on to the next slide. So we're all from an international community here, and we're all in this together, as I said. Now, eventually, ladies and gentlemen, the world spread their knowledge, and how it did that was by learning. Now, perhaps we built up a herd community. You've probably heard that term today, but it was clear that people were actually contracting the Spanish flu, surviving from the Spanish flu, and building up some kind of immunity. I will explain that a little bit later in the presentation. But from these notices, you can see that we were now being more informed. Governments and authorities and the media, the written word, newspapers, were now spreading notices such as this. The one on the left is quite interesting. It says, coughs and sneezes spread diseases. It's as dangerous as a poison gas shell in the First World War. The spread of the Spanish flu menaces our war production. And the one on the right, you can see, you need to prevent the spread of this disease. So careless spitting, coughing, or sneezing spreads this pandemic. And that's exactly what we're learning today. Certain social practices, lockdown perhaps, will help in the eradication of COVID-19. And that's what we're seeing today. So what happened next? If we can just move forward. I believe this is the most important thing, to look at similarities with what happened in 1918 and what's happening today with COVID-19. So first of all, I'd like you to consider this. Both COVID-19 and the Spanish flu are what's known as novel viruses. In other words, they are new. There is no immunity or no known vaccine. There wasn't in 1918 and there wasn't today. We're hoping that our scientists are working hard as we speak to create a vaccine for COVID-19, which I'm sure they will do. But that's an important similarity. There are many similarities. If we look at the next one, both were global pandemics. Yes, they affected us as global citizens. In 1918, as like today, these viruses were spread throughout the world by travel. Then it was soldiers and refugees as a result of the Great War. Now perhaps it's tourists who spread this disease, spread this pandemic. Perhaps it was the businessmen who traveled between countries on business. So that's what our governments have done today. They've recognized that and they have locked down international travel. And that's an important thing. They couldn't do that in 1918. We have learned the lessons from history. The other thing we've got comparisons with is the controls. Back then, they understood that isolation was important, things such as quarantine. The fact that we are all sitting at home now, I hope, watching this presentation, and we're doing it not only for the good of ourselves, we're doing it for the good of fellow people. We're doing it for the good of our communities. We know that by quarantining ourselves, we are going to beat the spread of this current virus. So things like disinfectants, for example, we understand that that's important. The fact that when we touch surfaces, the fact that if there's any contact with people, we have to be very, very careful. And that's why our governments have banned public gatherings, as they did in 1918. If you consider the authorities in a place like Philadelphia, can you imagine how much they must have regretted allowing that homecoming parade to actually take place? So that's why, despite our disappointments of not going to restaurants, not going to the cinema or theatres or those concerts that we so enjoy, we are doing that for a reason, ladies and gentlemen. It's so important to remember that. And of course, the PPE, or the personal protection equipment. You saw in that wonderful video from San Francisco that people were wearing masks and gloves, and they also understood the need to disinfect and to self-isolate. There are many similarities. We can look at the next point. Now, you're probably wondering, where did COVID-19 come from? Well, you've seen in the press and you've seen on TV, I'm sure, that the source is from China. Yes, many of us were absolutely horrified by those images that came from those markets where live animals were actually getting killed and they were being eaten. There's a suggestion that that is where it's actually coming from. But the Spanish flu actually also originated from an animal source. Then it was either from pigs or birds. Some scientists argue that it's from a bird source, others say from pigs. But what we do know that, again, this virus originated from animals. I believe that the COVID-19 virus, the actual source, will come out in time. Well, I hope it will. But at the moment, there is still a lot of debate amongst scientists and probably politicians where this actually originated from. China has been labeled with the source of these pandemics. In fact, as you remember from a slide about the global pandemics, the Great Plague of London, the Black Death, actually originated from China, which is quite incredible in terms of a comparison. Now, in 2020, even the Chinese acknowledged that that's where it came from. But you're probably wondering where the comparison, because I argued that actually the first case of the Spanish flu was from that army camp in Kansas in America. Well, would you believe, during my research, we found evidence, in fact, an article in National Geographic a few years ago, where scientists are actually claiming that the Spanish flu of 1918 originated in China some years earlier. In fact, it was Chinese migrants, again, traveling from work, that entered Canada and traveled south into America that spread this virus. And probably the lesson you can take from that is, again, the Americans are not keen to be labeled with having this themselves as the source of any pandemic. The final similarity at the bottom, we can see here, is the fact of information control. Now, I'm providing information with you today, and thank you again for joining me. But what about government censure? What about the likes of Boris Johnson, Donald Trump? Originally, they were keen to play down the seriousness of these pandemics. And that's exactly what happened in 1918. The American and certainly the British government did not want to affect the morale of the war effort. So therefore, they did not release all the information early enough. So I believe we've got to look at the media, even today, and be critical in terms of question the information we're being fed. We're all obsessed, aren't we, with the stats? How many people are actually dying from the disease and how many people have actually got this disease? I believe we don't actually know. It is our governments that are releasing that information. Here in South Africa, for example, we've only got something like 70 recorded deaths. Now, I believe that's impossible. A country with almost 50 million and plus in the population, there's got to be more. But it's, of course, we're relying on what people are telling us. And of course, we do not know that people are dying from the coronavirus as opposed to other diseases that they die of on a daily basis. Certainly that will be the case in Pakistan as well, amongst those people in the lower social economic brackets. Now, national prestige is linked to that, and I've also put down a second wave question mark. I do believe we will get a second wave of this current coronavirus, and that's why our governments are so reluctant to let us go back to normal, because that second wave will be as destructive, perhaps, as the first, potentially. But now we understand how to behave socially in terms of lockdowns, in terms of disinfectants and quarantine as well. So we respect this pandemic. If we look at the differences, though, that's quite interesting, which is the next slide. Now, this is the one that I picked up on. You may have heard this, but the greatest age group to be affected by the Spanish flu in 1918 were actually young people. That's right, in the age bracket from 18 to 45 years. Now, there are different reasons perhaps why that happened, but the main one, I believe, is because those people were either fighting in a war or being affected by the war. The Great War, of course, happened from 1914 to 1918, and it was young people who were affected in terms of malnutrition, in terms of losing their life, in terms of being thrust closer together. But an interesting point is, today, our elderly population are affected by the coronavirus. But what we found in 1918 is that a lot of people in the older age brackets had actually gone through a previous pandemic called the Russian flu in 1890. In 1890, the Russian flu had killed 1 million people worldwide. So if you had survived the Russian flu, we found that they actually built up an immunity to the Spanish flu in 1918. Isn't that interesting? So it's this idea of building up an immunity. The next difference, please. The incubation period. Well, it is twice as long with the current COVID-19 virus. Well, that is good and bad. We know that people can actually discover that they've got this virus through the outbreak of various symptoms, coughing, fever. We've been told what those symptoms are. It means you could then get into self-isolation before you affect anybody else. With the Spanish flu, however, you could get the first signs of this virus and then be dead within 24 hours, which is absolutely devastating if you think about it. So the problem is that with the current coronavirus, is a lot of us could be actually walking around with it now and showing no symptoms, as they did in 1918. But that's a key thing to think about. The incubation period is an important factor. The next difference is the fatality rate. As I mentioned, the Spanish flu killed up to 5% of those people infected with it. We know now, thankfully, the coronavirus affects a tiny percentage of those people infected with it. So the vast majority of those of us who have have developed symptoms of the coronavirus and have gone on to be infected by it will get through this, and we will live a full and healthy life, thankfully. If we look at the next difference here, the medical knowledge, well, it's clear. We are now 100 years on. We have lived through various challenges, HIV, AIDS, SARS, swine flu. We know that treatment techniques now in 2020 are far more superior to what we experienced in 1918. And surely, guys, that's good news, isn't it? It means we do not have to worry about the future if we all adopt these protocols. And my last point here is important. Tools of communication. They didn't have internet in 1918. Well, of course they didn't. It means we can communicate. It means I can go on a live Zoom call to you now all around the world, and I can offer you this information, which I hope is helping you. What are the lessons from history? Well, we know, as Howard Markle has said here, and he's the president at the Center for the History of Medicine, that we are in a much better place to handle the pandemic than we were 100 years ago. And that's got to be remembered. So if we can go on now to the final slide, which I'm going to just draw up my conclusions here. What are the key lessons from history? Well, number one, remember that the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic killed more people than the First World War. Now that is quite incredible. The current coronavirus, while it is very serious, does not kill people in those numbers because we now have the knowledge to cope with this. The second lesson from history, I believe, is this one. We should learn from the mistakes of 1918. As I said to you at the start, what is the point of history if we do not learn from it? We know that social distancing is imperative to beating this. So please, guys, and I implore you to do this, even if our governments say we can go back to some sense of normality, it is still important that we respect social distancing because the second wave will come if we go back to normal, and that is a fact. The next lesson, please. Doesn't it just? These viruses affect everyone. I've already mentioned Gandhi in 1918. Well, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Lloyd George also were affected by the virus. And we know in modern times, look at Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. He was in intensive care recently because of the coronavirus. These viruses affect everyone, each and every one of us, regardless of our wealth, regardless of our living conditions, regardless of our status. And I think it's important when we look at these rich and famous people also in the same boat, that is the fact. We are in this together. The next lesson, please. Let's not make this political. When I looked at those early speeches from Donald Trump, for example, I was dismayed that he was trying to make this political. He was trying to blame other people for what was happening. No one is to blame. This is something we must face together. We require serious leadership to guide us at this time. Those people we can look up to and respect. As I said, here in South Africa, we're actually thankful that Cyril Ramaphosa, our president, has stepped forward and shown strong, direct leadership in tackling this pandemic. And I hope where you are, your own leaders are doing the same. The next lesson. And this is the most important message from my presentation today, ladies and gentlemen. I know you're sitting there, you're concerned, and you're worried about the future. You're worried about the next time you're going to see your friends and family. But remember, our future is ahead of us. Humanity has survived far worse pandemics than the current coronavirus. Just remember that. We will get through this as we have got through far worse things in our history. I want to leave you now with a wonderful story. This is Captain Tom Moore. Now, Captain Tom Moore is probably the most famous person in Britain at the moment. Before I play this video, I just want to give you some background. This gentleman is nearly 100 years of age, and he fought in the Second World War. He decided he wasn't going to sit by and watch this virus affect his country. So what he did is quite remarkable, and I'm going to just show you the video now.
And here he comes, Captain Tom Moore, approaching his 100th birthday, 100 laps of his garden during lockdown, all of the money going to NHS charities, a guard of honour from the 1st Battalion, the Yorkshire Regiment. Inches to go, and there he is. Congratulations. Well done. Absolutely amazing, amazing achievement. Captain Tom, how do you feel this morning?
Fine. I mean, yes. I mean, I'm surrounded by the right sort of people, so yes, I feel fine. I hope you're all feeling fine too.
Well, we are feeling much more fine. I think we've all been inspired. The whole country, it seems like the whole world has been inspired by your achievement.
Oh, thank you.
Really great to see you this morning.
Thank you, Terry. Back to me, please. So that was quite an incredible story, as you can see. Captain Tom Moore there, 100 years of age, did 100 laps of his garden. I mean, incredible man. But I just want to say to you, can you believe that that gentleman has raised £27 million for the National Health Service in Great Britain? Just shows you we can all do our bit. And it's stories like that that actually inspire us at this moment. And I want you to think about how you can do your bit. I hope by just giving this presentation, I'm doing my bit to contribute. So there are positives from what's happening at the moment. The world is taking a breather. We're all sitting quietly and we're thinking about our futures. Of course we are. And it will lead to anxiety. It will lead to stress. But if we all do our bit and we can think of others at this time, I believe it will actually help us. Now, I've mentioned the odd famous person during this speech, but who more famous than Queen Elizabeth II, the Queen of England? And 2 weeks ago, she made this speech, which was quite unprecedented to the world, where she actually gave a message of hope. And if I could just have the last slide there, please, Terry. The Queen said, now I'm not a royalist, I must admit this, but her words were inspiring. She said, "This time we join with all nations across the globe in a common endeavour, using the great advantages of science and our instinctive compassion to heal. We will succeed, and that success will belong to every one of us." And I believe that message is so true. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation.
Thank you so much, Dean. That was fantastic. We're just going to, for a second or two, unmute everyone so you can give him a round of applause.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was an amazing session. Thank you so much. It was amazing.
Thank you.
Okay, great. We actually have the blessing. Okay, we actually have now questions. Sorry, unmuted me by mistake. Dean is kind enough to answer some questions, and we have gotten in advance questions from you. But normally we begin every presentation with first and foremost blessing. And so Annabelle is here. She normally does the blessing before we begin everything, but right now she's going to do it anyhow as a special favor for us because we're just going with the flow. So first we have Anadal, who is going to do a blessing.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahus samad, lam yalid wa lam yulad wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad.
Thank you so much, Anadal. This entire talk is greatly meaningful, and it's a gift from Dean, so we're very grateful for that. So we will go back to now the Q&A. Terry, if you can kindly spotlight Dean, not me. I will start reading out the questions. So Dean has made the request that these questions, of course, have come in advance, but instead of him reading it, he's going to have me read them this week. If you have any new questions, please just put them in the chat box and we will ask them as they come. And we have the next 20 minutes just for this Q&A, and then he is available to answer additional questions via email. His entire information, as well as a little thank you message from him, because he's wonderful, will be sent to all of you. And then we've already asked permission to give your emails to him and are asking all of you to reply on that so that we can also keep the two of you in touch, since he's one of the most important people to have as an asset, especially now, in addition to being wonderful. So now I will go to the first question. and it is by Maniza Butt. She's a partner at KPMG Pakistan, and she is wanting to ask Dean, what is the science behind a pandemic occurring after approximately every 100 years? We have seen the plague in 1720, cholera in 1820, Spanish flu in 1920, and now coronavirus in 2020. Dean, back to you to answer that.
Thank you. Thanks, Tara. And that's a fantastic question, of course. First of all, thank you for that wonderful round of applause. It really did make my day. Of course, lessons from history. That's what people are going to be doing now. They're going to be looking back at comparisons. And you rightly said, there is a pattern here. That perhaps every 100 years something like this happens. Now, I'm, of course, a doctor of history. I'm not a doctor of medicine or a pandemic scientist as such. But what I can do is look at trends. And you rightly said there is a trend occurring here. Now, perhaps like the role of war in human development, of course, in the tragedy of a war, we lose large numbers of life. Now, despite war being happening around the world, of course, we're never in a fully peaceful global environment. There's an argument that a pandemic like this occurs because of overpopulation, because people are living closer together, because there's a difference in the way we're living. Now, I alluded to in my talk that this particular virus, like, for example, like what happened with the Spanish flu, actually came from an animal source. But of course, it's our interaction, it's human beings' interaction with animals that have caused this. And that's exactly perhaps what we're going to be looking at. So if historians and medical scientists actually know where these viruses come from, we can look at the patterns and perhaps, I hope, stop this happening in another 100 years' time. But as I mentioned, and as I've alluded to, if you think about my slide on the global pandemics that I talked about, even if we go back to what was happening in the 1980s or the early 2000s, we have faced various challenges. SARS and swine flu. I mean, swine flu was quite remarkable in the amount of people it actually killed. At that stage, it wasn't a global pandemic, it was more contained. But now, because of our travel, because of the fact we can just hop onto a plane and we can inadvertently spread these viruses all around the world, we can take this pandemic and it becomes absolutely virulent within a matter of days. And so that's what we're looking at. But to answer your question, there is no definitive proof. There is some kind of conspiracy theory, of course, that it is every 100 years. But if we look at how the population of the world have grown and where those cases actually broke out, there are similarities. There are similarities in the way the virus was spread, and there was similarities in the way that it actually was created in the first place.
Thank you so much, Dean. So now I'm reading a question from Alexa Parr, who's a translator in Brussels. Here's her twofold question. The Spanish flu clearly made more victims, yet never caused such economic havoc. People continue to work with mass and brave sense than I'm told. Are we suffering from weaker immune systems or greater death estrangement, or did the conspirationalists manage to scare the living daylights out of us? And the second part of her question is, can post-war booming industrial recovery in 1919 somehow be compared to the digital revolution we're expected to surf on 2021? Dean, over to you. We have a lot of questions, so if you can do quick answers and people can talk to you on email, that's great, as we have a lot of them.
Of course, I'll be delighted, as we said, to follow this up via email. So please don't think I'm not going to answer all your questions in time. I mean, that's a wonderful question from Alexa there. We're all looking at this idea of recovery and what's going to happen. You mentioned that in 1918, people got on with things. Well, there was, of course, lockdown. There was a different way of life. There's this idea that people were more resilient in the olden days. Well, remember also that we have to look at the Great War. The First World War caused devastation economically. Somebody asked me this the other day. Can we separate the socio-economic impact of the Spanish flu from what actually happened as a result of the First World War? And I think it's quite impossible. So the world was coming from a great war that affected everybody. So there was a case of they had to recover from that 4-year period anyway. So through the use, as you said, of masks and social distancing was a recovery. Remember, guys, it took 2 years to eradicate the Spanish flu. And to go back to the second part of your question, if we do not respect our return to some form of normality, this current crisis could go on for that long and maybe more. So it's important we recognize that. So I believe we will face some form of soft lockdown, as it were, and those people that are deemed essential will be allowed to return to work. In terms of the second part of the question, yes, perhaps we will see some kind of digital revolution. Now, of course, in 1918, I'm sure that there were medical advances as a result of this. We know the Industrial Revolution hadn't happened that long ago, so there were great advances. But back then, it was just as much as a result of coming out of a 4-year global war that caused the recovery.
Thank you so much, Dean. We have a question from Nerys from Madrid. Nowadays, people are always talking about understanding the deeper meaning of a social life, nature, and solidarity. Do you think this understanding will last and make a permanent change in the presence of humankind as a whole, as part of nature?
Well, greetings to Madrid, beautiful city there. I hope so, is my short answer. I really do hope so. I believe that this has given us all as individuals and as communities and as nations to actually sit and to think about where we want to go in the future. There is no doubt that we were putting pressure on this beautiful planet of ours. I mean, that's not me speaking, that is scientists as well. I'm sure you've seen on the internet the wonderful images of animals returning to habitats that we have actually pushed them out of. It's recovering, the planet is breathing, and that's something that gives me great comfort. From a spiritual point of view, from a soulful point of view as well. I mean, historians can be quite hard with their facts, but I believe that that is actually happening. I'd like to believe that we don't all just go back to normal. We don't all go back to just taking things for granted, taking our loved ones for granted, taking our environment for granted. We will see. But that, at the end of the day, that's up to each and every one of us. And again, I think strong leadership plays a part in that. I think we can look at things like our technology, how it's used. We can look at the use of fossil fuels. We can look at how we're actually damaging the environment now, and actually be a bit more respectful of our environment and our fellow humans.
Great, thank you so much, Dean. Now this is from Khadija Usman from Lahore, co-founder for Smile. After the Spanish flu, did some countries' economies revive more quickly? What policies, in your opinion, Dean, could have led to such resilience?
Well, that is, forgive the pun, the million-dollar question, of course. And we're actually writing my next talk, which I hope you'll listen to at some point. We're actually going to look at the recovery from the 1929 depression, which is a result, a spin-off from what happened in 1918, the Spanish flu. It led inadvertently, a lot of countries didn't recover. There was a depression, and then the Second World War, of course. So what people are looking for now is exactly what you asked in this question. How and when will countries and nations and people and individual businesses recover from this particular crisis? And there isn't a simple answer. If we look at history, after 1918, it won't surprise you that countries like Great Britain, the greatest empire the world had known during the 1800s, and then America, which was arguably going to become now our greatest empire, our greatest superpower, they recovered quickly. In fact, the Western world did recover quicker, first world countries than third world countries. So the likes of South Africa, the likes of pre-partition India, of course, took a lot longer to recover economically and socially from the devastation of what happened in 1918, because those superpowers had the means. And remember, like we're looking at now with the messages that are coming out from America and Great Britain and countries like that, it is about social it's about national prestige. They are trying to protect the economy. They are trying to protect their businesses. They are trying to protect their brand. And that's exactly what we saw in 1918. Dear old Spain came out and actually declared that they had this national pandemic and the rest of the world looked at them and gave them the label of that. So we will see, we will learn lessons from this. And as I said, I'm currently doing research and I'm looking at how countries came out of the Great Depressions in history, as we will have to do so again here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dean. We have a question from Shanaz Ramsey, an amazing PR guru here in Karachi. How is it that most pandemics begin in China, but they get over it with the least number of casualties?
Well, Shanaz, great question. For the conspiracy theorist upon us, I must admit, one of the things that a lot of things are on social media, but you've probably heard this one. Somebody said China has just won the Third World War without firing a shot. Now, I don't know what you think about that, but you're right. Why do these viruses seem to start in China? And we can go back to the Great Plague of the 1300s there. Well, it's lifestyle. It's about how people are living. I mean, those horrific images from those live animal markets we saw. You know, this is what's being blamed now for the current virus. Well, we can only assume that's how people were living in years gone by. So there's a certain thing about the Chinese lifestyle, certainly, that encourages the spread of these viruses between animals and human beings. So that's the first answer here. Why they recover? Well, I think they're informed. I think they were far more prepared for this. For example, they've experienced in smaller epidemics within their country that we don't even know about, that they were actually informed of. And if I can give you an example from my own life here, a colleague of mine who's actually Chinese, he was prepared for this. He actually knew or predicted that this was going to happen. Now, I thought that was quite strange, but that clearly they got access to information, access to technology, perhaps, that we haven't got. Now, the conspiracy theorists would say perhaps it was planned. Now, that is something we'll see. I sincerely hope that none of this was planned, but we should look to China for examples. And by the way, did you know that Zoom is actually a Chinese company? This mechanism, which we're actually talking through at the moment, before the coronavirus had 10 million users. Now it's got 300 million users. So there are certain aspects of the Chinese economy are certainly going to get a boost from this.
Yes, and that's a savvy insight that you're sharing there as well, Dean. Thank you for that. Now we have a question from Shireen Kaushi, one of the best pastry chefs we know, who's now in Toronto. The second bout of the Spanish flu was much more severe than the first. Was that because the strain of the virus has become more virulent? Could that be possible for the current coronavirus as well?
Very good question, of course, and it's something that I hope our medical scientists certainly have got a handle on. And now, as I said, as much as I know my facts and my dates, I'm not a doctor of science. But what I can say is we would face a similar situation if we don't get a handle on this. There was this question. It's questionable whether the second wave was as serious as the first wave with the 1918 pandemic. Just be careful of that information. Certainly in certain regions it was. You see, it was down to governments. It was down to, as we've seen, towns and cities to have their own control. Somewhere like America, has their own state control. It was also down to the individual towns and cities to have their control. So if they did not get a hold of the early wave, or the first wave, should I say, the second wave was more serious, if not, it was more virulent, as it were. So just be careful of generalizing there, because that wasn't necessarily the case in terms of the second wave killing more people. But certainly there's an argument in science that if a second strain or a mutation of this strain develops, it can actually be more harmful than the original one. And that's exactly what we have to guard against today.
Dean, we have a question about, there's riots already in South Africa. We've heard that riots have started. Did they take place in the Spanish flu time? And do you suspect that there'll be riots around the world, particularly hunger riots or any form? And would love your insight on that.
Yeah, great question. I think that's one of the other dangers we are facing in all societies is the breakdown of civil obedience, or civil disobedience, should we say. If people get desperate, and there's nothing more desperate than someone who's hungry, then therefore they're going to act accordingly. Now, we've just seen here in South Africa that the president came on last night, and he's actually going to offer incredible amount of food aid to the population, because he recognizes that that is a key issue here. It's all very well asking people to stay at home and not go to work, but if they're hungry, they will do what is required. And I know it's probably a similar situation in parts of Pakistan as well. So that, in fact, could happen anywhere. If people get desperate and hungry, they will act accordingly. What I will say in defense of South Africa here, remember please that South Africa news from here tends to get reported more widely than elsewhere. So what you're seeing here in South Africa is because our Western media, a lot of them are based down here. It's a lovely place to be, by the way. So the reporters are based in a place like Cape Town, and they will tend to report that. So it doesn't mean that those kind of cases of civil disobedience and riots are not happening elsewhere. It's what the media releases, and that's key here. We understand what's happening through our TVs. So it's a good example, of course, to use. South Africa is a great example because people live in close proximity here. I mean, those of us who've got space and privilege, you know, it's a different lifestyle. So to answer your question, of course, and that could happen everywhere. In 1918, yes, there was a breakdown of society in those areas, those certainly third world countries that faced starvation. You know, this national crisis that was declared. We saw the evidence from partition India, didn't we? That on the back of the devastation from a world war, now 10 million people officially had lost their lives as a result of the Spanish flu pandemic. And people were leaving the cities, they were moving around, they were struggling to find a living and find food. And that could face us today. So that's what our governments must do before anything else, of course, is while they put us in some form of lockdown, they must make sure that food production continues. Food production is key. And I know here in South Africa, our farmers have been allowed to continue as normal, which is just as important as the doctors who are in our hospitals.
Thank you so much, Dean. We have a question from Sherbanu, who's a senior journalist for the News International, and she wants to know what advantage do we have in the current scenario in terms of technology in this information age that we didn't have at the time of the Spanish flu? So what disadvantages and advantages that way do you think, and what lessons can we learn?
Well, yeah, great question. I hope I covered quite a few of bit of the answer there in my presentation. But certainly we are now 100 years on. We are in a better space. We are better equipped, of course, to cope with this. Just to give you an example, penicillin hadn't even been invented at the time of the First World War. That only came in the 1920s, albeit it wouldn't have cured the virus, but it would have helped with, you know, secondary infections, etc. We can learn from the past. We can learn from the personal protection equipment they were using, what spread, how it was spread. So, for example, if you look at the case of Seattle in America, they banned all social gatherings after the First World War finished, whereas Philadelphia didn't. And as I said, 14,000 people lost their lives as a result of just a homecoming parade. So we can learn so many lessons from the past. We are in a better place now in terms of technology. So something as simple as a ventilator. Ventilation equipment, for example, we're finding people who are really struggling with the coronavirus. They're going into hospital, and some, unfortunately, are going into intensive care, but we now are able to help them breathe artificially. So something like that is important. Remember the fatality rate. 5% of those who actually were infected by the Spanish flu lost their lives. Now, the figures are minimal in terms of that. I know it sounds serious, of course it does. But in terms of the wider population, we are not losing lives in the numbers. People are building up a form of immunity. We know that. That's important. I know perhaps that's going to be another question I'm going to be asked. This idea of herd immunity, the fact that to get the virus, we then build up some kind of protection from it. We can inadvertently protect each other. That is something we are learning, and the scientists are working on now. They're also working, and I'm sure they've got a vaccine now. But as you know, in this modern world, everything has to be tested. So I'm sure within a matter of months, there'll be news about something practical that is actually going to eradicate this virus.
Wonderful, Dean. We have a question from Kamran from Toronto, who is a senior audit partner. And Kamran's question has to do with, he said, what is your estimate for COVID-19 to be controlled substantially, even if not totally eradicated? And will the developed and developing parts of the world be at par in combating this? And how can they help each other? And particularly connecting it to foreseeing businesses and economies, and connect that back to recovery plans and third world versus the rest of the world.
Yeah, well, it's a very good question, of course. In terms of you know, making the comparisons with recovery, which what we're doing research at the moment. We're finding that different parts of the world did recover quicker in 1918. That was clear. So those Western developed nations did recover quicker. They had the infrastructure, they had the medical equipment, they had the money to put into investing into medical knowledge, science, for example. Remember, it's also important to look at the way people live, the actual space in which people live. Often, as you know, in third world countries, people are living close together. They're in confined spaces. The lack of sanitation, the lack of access to medical care, the lack of information is an important thing as well, creates a spread of pandemics like this, a virus, in far greater numbers. So we've seen in the past that the superpowers, albeit Great Britain, America, the Western powers, the European nations, recovered quicker following the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, and perhaps we'll see the same today. Now, that's what I'm going to be doing now over the next few days, is going to be really looking at the facts and the figures for that. I think we can look at how countries came out of the Great Depression, for example, in the late 1920s, how they recovered, the techniques they used, and what they actually did to push their economy forward, because that's just as important. I know people don't like to talk about economy because this is a question of life and death, but remember, we have to have an effective economy for us all to live, and that makes sure we can invest in science, we can invest in infrastructure that will help us get through the next pandemic.
Wonderful, Dean. We're shortly to wrap up, so I wanted to begin with some thank yous. And before we do that, I wanted to mention that you have a big speech on Monday that everyone has the opportunity to register and be a part of. So you can speak about that. And wanted to thank you in particular, particularly Terry, who the co-host Terry and Ahmad and Rafia and Bilal and the whole team of Ladies Fund. And we've had people from 10 different cities we've calculated, and we have Samir Dosal, the president of the Canada-Pakistan Business Council, with us. We also have the amazing Isa Rehman and 8 people from Turkey, and we have Janjet, who I believe is the president of the Turkish American Association, and some wonderful, wonderful people here. But the most important person, of course, is our audience. Dean is our star, but you, our guests who have joined us, are our pleasure and joy. And we really feel blessed to have been able to host you from Karachi today and impart whatever knowledge we can to help you. So thank you very much for joining us today. As said, please continue to send messages if you want to connect directly with Dean, and he will invite you to his future talks. And thank you once again. Have a wonderful day, everyone. And thank you, Dean. Bye.